Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Hello everyone, it is Christmas week at the time that we're recording this video, and I imagine a lot of you guys are going to be opening presents and you're going to be doing after Christmas shopping, and so we're going to keep it a pretty light week. I'm going to be out of town actually for pretty much the entirety of Christmas week, almost going up to New Year's Eve. And so I figured we kind of go back to the old school form of Comics Explained, if only for this week, and basically explain nothing but characters. Just do a whole bunch of character explanations. And because we don't really have a whole lot of character explanations on DC, in this video, we're going to explain Kyle Rayner, the Green Lantern. So Kyle Rayner made his debut in DC Comics back in Green Lantern Volume 3, issue number 48 in January of 1944, and he was created by Ron Marz and Daryl Banks. Now, a little bit of history here, because Kyle Rayner was really the byproduct of DC not really hard rebooting the Green Lantern mythos, but really more soft rebooting it. And I'll explain what that means here in a second. But a little bit of history here. People look at the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths and they see it as strictly a hard reboot. And indeed it was, right? I mean, it was the first time that DC had basically relaunched their entire landscape with new origin stories and all that kind of stuff. But the reality of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and the reason why you got future events like 0 Hour Crisis in Time, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, is because one, there were a lot of continuity errors that came after it, but the lion's share of what was supposed to happen with the post-crisis landscape is that DC would look at that landscape and they would say, okay, after we've rebooted and we've drawn all this attention and we're getting a ton of sales, what do people really want to see? And so it was gauging what kind of comics were selling by just kind of looking at what people were buying and calling it a day. The result of this is that when DC looked at Green Lantern, Hal Jordan just wasn't really a bankable character. And that was something that had kind of been established during Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams' run, as great as it was, when Hal Jordan and Green Arrow were basically backup features in the Flash comics. They couldn't hold their own comic because their comic wasn't selling. And so as a result of that, when it got around to, 1994, after the death of Superman, which I always consider to be an unofficial crisis due to all the things that were changed as a result of that story, DC basically said, okay, let's rework the entirety of the Green Lantern mythos. And so what you got was a story called Green Lantern Emerald Twilight. And Emerald Twilight was designed to follow off the heels of the death of Superman, with Hal Jordan returning from a mission in space, only to find out that Coast City had been totally destroyed. And so using his ring in a way that wasn't officially sanctioned by the Guardians of the Universe, and in fact was frowned upon in the sense that he used it for personal gain by essentially recreating Coast City and all the people in it. He was ultimately brought before the Guardians and then was essentially chastised for his actions. This of course results in Hal Jordan, who was already brokenhearted, essentially losing his mind, going crazy, killing all the Guardians except for Ganthet and a whole host of the Green Lanterns, including like Sinestro and Kilowog and so on, and then basically christening himself Parallax and going forward from there. The result of this is that Kyle Rayner was introduced as a new and younger and more vibrant version of Green Lantern. Now, the funny thing about this is that Ron Marz did an interview with Comic Book Resources back in 2003 when he was talking about his taking on of the book. And the reason why I did that interview and others is because his time on Green Lantern, or at least when he took over, was highly divisive among fans. Fans were very, very divided about it because some looked at it and said, yes, it's time for a change. Hal Jordan is just old hat. Whereas other people who were very much attached to Hal Jordan didn't want to see things change. And so the result was that you kind of had this splitting of the Green Lantern fan base, some of whom loved what Ron Marz did and others hated what Ron Marz did. But regardless of the circumstance, Ron Marz was ultimately just kind of given the Green Lantern book with issue number 47. Literally, he got a phone call on like Friday night by Kevin Dooley, who was the editor of Green Lantern at the time. He got a call on Friday night, said, do you want the Green Lantern book? And Ron Marz said yes, because I'm a huge Green Lantern fan. And he was like, okay, here's the partial scripts for like issues 46, 47, and 48. Have at it. And so he had like these insane deadlines that he had to make. And it was kind of crazy. But the fact remains that with Ron Marz taking over for Kyle Rayner, Kyle was basically visited by Ganthet, and Ganthet essentially said, hey, look, you're essentially the last of the real Green Lanterns. Now, guys like John Stewart and guys like Guy Gardner were still around. The difference is that because it was a reworking of the Green Lantern mythos, they were removed from the Green Lantern Corps. You ended up having John Stewart join a group called the Dark Stars, and Guy Gardner actually ended up losing his power ring in a battle against Hal Jordan, and then he really kind of gained a new type of power in the form of his warrior persona. And we'll go more into that once we get into like Guy Gardner explained. But when Ron Marz took over the stories, the idea was that he didn't simply want to just throw a new Green Lantern out there, right? Because when it comes to comic book fans, we grow attached to characters the longer that we read them and the more that we identify with them. And so, recognizing the idea of Hal Jordan being removed would not really sit well with a lot of existing Green Lantern fans. The notion was that while Emerald Twilight basically saw the collapse of the Corps, Hal Jordan becoming Parallax, and that was really the end of him, the introduction of a new Green Lantern had to be done done in such a way to where fans wanted to identify with him, or their passing interest about him would turn into the idea of, well, let's see where this goes, right? You know, continuing interest that would go beyond the first handful of issues. And so what you got between issues number 48 and 51, really in the span of these three comics, is you got this wholesale introduction of who Kyle Rayner was, what he was capable of, and how he learned how to use his powers. And the reality is that Ron Mars borrowed heavily from the concept of Lana Lang in the Superman comics, as well as the the death of Gwen Stacy in the night Gwen Stacy died from Jerry Conway in 1971. And the reason why I say this is because for the Superman mythos, those of you guys who are familiar with it, Lana Lang was the Smallville childhood friend of Clark Kent, and was the first person to learn about his powers, at least if you go based on the Jeff Johns secret origin. And then in turn, she was the one that helped him navigate the waters on how to use those abilities. Much the same way, Alexandra DeWitt was introduced in issue number 48 as the girlfriend of Kyle Rayner. And so the idea was that where Kyle Rayner himself was really kind of having this devil-may-care attitude, in the sense that he was reckless, he never really seemed to take himself or anything he really did seriously. And this was really a problem for Alexandra, because it was kind of that thing of learn to take yourself seriously, right? I mean, if you ever want to make anything out of yourself in this world, you have to become a more serious person. And so over the course of these three issues, she taught him basically how to use his abilities. The idea that what Ganthet had said is that the ring can essentially allow him to create any construct he wants to, and there's no limit to his imagination. There's this hilarious moment actually in issue number 51 where they're standing on the beach, and like she's like, well, create something. And so he creates her as a Green Lantern construct in like this super thin string bikini. But basically, Ron Mars used this as a way to introduce the idea that Kyle Rayner was beyond Hal Jordan insofar as what he could construct using his ring, right? Because Hal Jordan constructed like boxing gloves or like a giant fist or a hand or something like that. And that was really it. It was pretty limited because Hal Jordan really kind of, the stories maintained the original 1950s element of just something interesting and intriguing that's easily identifiable, but nothing overly complicated. Hence one of the reasons why Hal Jordan never really seemed to succeed beyond the stories in the 1950s. But under these three issues, or in these three issues under Ron Mars, we started learning things that Kyle Rayner could create like anime characters and like mecha constructs, these super advanced constructs in ways that we hadn't really seen before. Crafting a Green Lantern suit for himself that was in a lot of ways starkly different from the suit that Hal Jordan had worn. It was basically taking these three issues and even going into issue 52 and 53 and saying, this is not your granddad's Green Lantern, this is a whole different beast. And so this really kind of came to a head in issue number 54 when the Gwen Stacy concept was taken by Ron Mars and thrown into the comics, and it really pissed off a lot of fans who had already began to latch on. And the reason why is because as comic book fans, and this is something that I've been guilty of in the past, but one of the things that we usually end up doing is oftentimes we put ourselves in the role of the character that we're reading, right? So like for people who were fans of Kyle Rayner, they imagine themselves living Kyle Rayner's life. A byproduct of this is that Kyle Rayner's love interest, Alexandra DeWitt, became the love interest of the fans who were reading his comics. And so in issue number 54 of Green Lantern Volume 3, basically Alexandra DeWitt was killed by a villain named Major Force when she was stuffed in a refrigerator. Now the reality of Ron Mars is he was taking the Gwen Stacy concept, right? Insofar that where the death of Uncle Ben basically taught Spider-Man that he has to be responsible with the powers that he has, the death of Gwen Stacy taught Spider-Man he can't be reckless with his powers. And that's exactly how this played out with Kyle Rayner. And so the death of Alexandra DeWitt really coincided with Ron Mars kind of picking up some loose plot threads, or at the very least adapting them to the new Green Lantern story in terms of the villain Mongol, who was seeking revenge on both Superman as well as Green Lantern following his defeat in the events leading up to Emerald Twilight after the death of Superman, as well as Mongol allying himself with Major Force. And so the result of this is that issue number 54, of course, again, saw Alexandra DeWitt being stuffed in a refrigerator, effectively being killed, and that allowed Ron Mars to move Kyle Rayner away from not only Los Angeles, but from his reckless attitude, traveling to New York, and then falling closer in line and really becoming a tried and true superhero in the DC Comics landscape, as opposed to a sort of outlier. And what I mean by that is between 1994 and 2002, there were a lot of changes going on in DC Comics at the time, but because Kyle Rayner was basically being brought closer in line with the superhero landscape, he was essentially a part of all of them. During 1994's Zero-Hour Crisis in Time, whereby Hal Jordan as Parallax tried to essentially rewrite all of reality to make it a more peaceful place, Kyle Rayner, alongside the then Justice League at the time, the Justice League International team, written by J.M.D. Mateus and Keith Giffen, essentially came along and saw the defeat of Hal Jordan ultimately. He ended up meeting Jade, the daughter of Alan Scott, who alongside the rest of the JSA had returned during 1992's Armageddon Inferno event, fell in love with Jade after the two of them had become roommates in New York. There were a lot of things that were taking place at the time, but one of the most notable things that came out of this really took place as part of the events both with Final Night as well as the return of JLA and then eventually Ion. Now what I mean here is that the JLA team had basically returned in 1997 under Grant Morrison with the official reformation of the original Justice League of America team from the old 1950s and 60s, really from 1960 going forward, in the post-crisis landscape, something that was highly celebrated by a lot of existing DC fans. Kyle Rayner being brought directly onto the team was exceedingly important because up to that point he had appeared in Aquaman comics and some Deathstroke comics, and DC had spread him around, but outside of his own Green Lantern book and whatever appearances he made as part of the Titans team from 1994 with issue number 116, his relationship with Donna Troy, that was all you really got. But putting him on JLA effectively meant that he was officially a member of the Justice League and officially one of the top tier heroes, something that existing Green Lantern fans who enjoy the concept of Kyle Rayner highly loved. At the same time, in 1996, you basically got a story called Final Night. And Final Night, for its part, while it did have a great big huge involvement with tons of superheroes and various individuals out there, you had a villain called Sun Eater. And the story itself was really more to kind of wrap up the plot threads of Hal Jordan insofar as he had just kind of been lingering there ever since the events of Emerald Twilight. The story essentially saw himself, quote unquote, sacrificing his life in order to absorb the Sun Eater, and his ring was essentially left inside the sun itself. Now he would return in 1999 during Days of Judgment and ultimately end up becoming the Spectre, but during that point in time, because of the fact that his ring was essentially left behind, there was a story that was written that was called The Circle of Fire that was done, I think, in 1999 as well, but basically focused on the idea of the introduction of a villain named Oblivion. And what you ended up getting here was Kyle Rayner facing off against this guy along with the Justice League who was captured, and at the end of the story you basically learned that Oblivion, along with the other Green Lanterns, quote unquote, that had been brought in from other realities, were really more just facsimiles of the various personal struggles that Kyle Rayner had dealt with and the various aspects of his personality. And so as a result of that, the Green Lanterns were ultimately reabsorbed into himself, Oblivion was defeated, the JLA was saved, and these mental blocks in the mind of Kyle Rayner were released. And what it meant was that this combined with the events of Final Night, basically allowing him to tap into and absorb the remaining energy of Hal Jordan's ring left in the sun, essentially meant that Kyle Rayner became a wholly new character. Now, that took place in issue number 146 of Green Lantern. The reality was that Ron Mars's run had finished with issue 125. Issues 126, 127, and 128 were taken over by Jay Faber for a little 3-issue temporary run, more or less, in order for DC to basically find a new writer and have them take over. Judd Winnick had basically taken over with issue number 129, but with issue 146 and the idea of Kyle Rayner becoming Ion, it was a whole new echelon of power, meaning he was doing things that Green Lanterns had never done before, right? So being able to be in multiple places at once, the guy was in effect God. The problem with this was that by the time you got to 2000 and you got even into 2002, the idea was that DC wanted to essentially kind of bring Green Lantern back, right? You had Jeff Johns, who was already on the scene, following his short tenure writing the Avengers in Marvel Comics, and the idea was, let's bring the entire team back, but the question became, how would they end up returning? Infinite Crisis was a concept that was being worked on, but Infinite Crisis wouldn't come to fruition until 2006, and Final Crisis wouldn't come to fruition until 2009. And so what you ended up getting was basically these series of events that were written in such a way to where during his time as Ion, you essentially had Kyle Rayner come to this realization that it was too much power for one man to handle, right? It was just too much for one individual to have, because ultimately it would lead to his downfall in the same way that Hal Jordan ended up falling down as a result of him becoming Parallax. And so over the course of the next 30 issues, with Judd Winnick basically beginning the process of stepping down in order for Ron Mars to come back in and wrap up Green Lantern Volume 3, you saw two major events take place. The first is that Ion, or I guess Kyle Rayner as Ion, had essentially dispersed those energies and recreated the Green Lantern Central Power Battery. And what this did was bring back the Guardians of the Universe, who in turn created new Green Lantern rings and then brought the Green Lantern Corps back when the rings were dispersed across the cosmos. The second event that had taken place is that Kyle Rayner had ended up fighting Major Force, and then ultimately, because of how the battle had gone, in the sense that Kyle Rayner had let his anger get the better of him, considered himself to be a danger to everybody that he cared about, and then left for the far reaches of space. And so what this did was segue directly into the events of Green Lantern Rebirth, the return of Hal Jordan, his soul essentially being returned to his physical body, since he'd only been lingering around as the Spectre following the events of Day of Judgment, and really his quote-unquote death, more or less, during the Final Night event, and then Kyle Rayner himself returning after learning the truth about Parallax. And with this basically coming as Jeff Johns taking over the Green Lantern story, everything began to shift in its entirety. The Green Lantern mythos was expanded in ways that nobody had ever really considered before. And what I mean by that is, up to that point, the idea of the yellow impurity, which is to say the weakness of the Green Lanterns, was simply just a concept that was there, and it had never really been fully explored, right? It was just the Green Lanterns are weak to the color yellow, done, and that was really all it was when it came to that mythos. Jeff Johns introduced the idea of lantern entities, in the sense that the reason why Green Lanterns are weak to the color yellow is because at some point in time time, the fear entity Parallax had been imprisoned inside the Green Lantern Central Power Battery and was kept there by the being Ion, by the entity of the Green Lanterns itself. And so with Parallax being stuck inside the ring, Parallax representing fear and fear being yellow, Green Lanterns were susceptible to fear because it was like introducing an ink stain into water, right? It just kind of spread throughout everything, and if given enough time, if not kept at bay, then it would basically spread throughout the entire core. So that was the entire basis behind the idea of the yellow impurity. But for Kyle Rayner himself, the truth about this is that for the most part, under Jeff Johns' run, he became a background character, not in the sense that he was being ignored. For the most part, when it came to Jeff Johns taking over Green Lantern, the first thing to do was to expand the mythos. The second thing was to drive up interest by introducing other Lantern Corps, kind of tying in the emotional spectrum insofar as the other Lantern Corps are based on the emotional spectrum, so the origins of the Red Lanterns and the Indigo Tribe and so on and so forth. And then of course, to focus on Hal Jordan as the main Green Lantern of Earth. He was the most popular version of the Green Lanterns that resided on Earth, leading up to, of course, his death and the introduction of Kyle Rayner, and so it made sense to focus on him as the main character of the story. Now for Kyle himself, one of the big things that came out of it is Kyle basically became home to the entity Ion, the entity of the Green Lanterns. And this was really kind of the return of Ion 2 is what a lot of people refer to it as. But again, the idea was that for the Sinestro Corps War, as that event broke out, it was to strip the Ion entity from Kyle Rayner to basically study it in the antimatter universe. This basically led Kyle Rayner to going back and becoming the original Green Lantern, to be removed from the realm of what was called the Torchbearer, meaning he was housing the Ion entity so that if the Green Lantern Corps was ever destroyed, he would be able to recreate it again. All these little things had kind of been introduced and then removed, but Kyle Rayner himself just kind of not really free floated, but just sort of went throughout the Green Lantern stories and took part in various events that went down, but was by no means the main focal point of Green Lantern. However, the idea of Jeff Johns putting Kyle on the back burner was sort of revealed for what it was in the prelude to Rise of the Third Army coming after the War of the Green Lanterns. And the idea here was that Jeff Johns had plans for Kyle Rayner insofar as part of this prelude, or at least as part of the story. What you got was the idea that seemingly one ring from all the other Lantern Corps came out of nowhere and all tried to bond themselves directly to Kyle Rayner. And what it did is it set the stage for the idea of Kyle being the only Green Lantern to ever really wield all of the Lantern rings up to that point in time. Now, it was only temporary, it didn't last for an exceedingly long period of time, and in fact, all the rings had basically been destroyed with the exception of the green and the orange ring, only for us to find out the orange ring was basically a construct that needed the help of Kyle Rayner. But once you went into the aftermath of the Rise of the Third Army storyline, what you got was these kind of trials of Kyle, insofar that if all these different rings had chosen Kyle Rayner, then what he needed to do was become a master of the rings in order to be able to utilize all the rings effectively. And so you ended up seeing these scenarios where, like, Atrocitus, for example, was trying to get Kyle Rayner to the point where he was so pissed off and would be a avatar or a bearer of sorts for the Red Lantern ring, which in turn would allow Kyle to master the Red Lantern ring and then basically use its power without succumbing to its influence. And it fell the exact same way with pretty much all the rings minus the Green Lantern, because he was already a Green Lantern at one point in time and had already mastered its willpower. And so following this, going into the Wrath of the First Lantern storyline and then going into Lights Out and a handful of stories from there, you basically ended up seeing this kind of transformation of Kyle, where he went from just a guy who was a Green Lantern at one point in time to a guy who could use the power of all the Lantern rings for his own ends, and then in turn help the various heroes across the universe. Now, Johns was very, very careful about this, right? Because if he had mishandled this, it would have turned into the Franklin Richards effect, right? If Franklin Richards is so powerful, then why doesn't he just fix everything that's wrong with the Marvel Universe whenever an event crops up? It's the same question people would have had about Kyle. If he's a Green Lantern, or if he's a Lantern that can essentially wield all of the Lantern rings, then why doesn't he just use all the Lantern rings to fix everything? And so that's one of the reasons why Jeff Johns introduced the idea of weaknesses within the various Lantern rings, the idea that Kyle Rayner could use them, but there are still limitations to all the things that he was able to pull off. And so going into Lights Out, what you ended up getting was Kyle using his rings to essentially help the various corps across the universe face off against Relic, this being from a different universe who believed the emotional spectrum would lead to the destruction of the main DC universe, and attempted to essentially destroy the emotional spectrum itself. The reality was that this basically led to Kyle Rayner and forces essentially defeating Relic, the day more or less being saved. This of course goes into the launch of the New 52. It basically went into Kyle Rayner essentially believing to have been dead. The idea was that the various entities had essentially sacrificed themselves to whatever was beyond the source wall, and that was essentially it, right? Kyle Rayner, along with Relic, had traveled to the source wall. Relic had been trapped inside the wall, but Kyle Rayner had passed through. And where everybody believed that Kyle Rayner had moved on to the afterlife, Kyle Rayner ultimately ended up returning to the New Guardians. And the result of this was that, given the nature of Kyle Rayner, given the power he possessed and what he was capable of, that ultimately his return had to be kept a secret. And so what it did is it allowed Jeff Johns to kind of usher Kyle Rayner off to the side, have him more or less become Space Jesus, because that's literally what he looked like. allowed him to become Space Jesus, and pretty much all the other aspects of his life had been left behind. His one-time relationship with Saronic Natu, which ultimately broke up, for Saronic Natu being the daughter of Sinestro, all these things had really kind of become aspects of his life that were no longer valid anymore. He was really just traveling across the universe, creating life, experimenting with life, different things like that, but more or less calling it a day. Now, because Kyle Rayner sort of existed as like, being able to harness the power of the white light or this white lantern ring or what have you, but because the power was too extreme, Kyle basically dispersed the ring among 6 other individuals so that if a time ever came when he had to utilize the full totality of the white light power, he could recall all the rings to himself and basically face whatever that threat happened to be. The issue with this is that DC was basically gearing up for the launch of DC Rebirth, right? We had basically concluded with Darkseid War. Things were essentially wrapping up. The idea of going into this relaunch of DC Comics in a way that would essentially drive interest back up again, but also see the return of a lot of the things that people missed from the New 52 that they wanted to see brought back. What you ended up getting was Robert Venditti essentially taking over the Green Lantern line of comics after Jeff Johns. And the issue with Kyle Rayner as kind of like this messianic character was that you couldn't really do anything with him. You couldn't really write a character with that level of power and have him face off against anything but like these massive threats. But at the end of the day, people wanted to see Kyle Rayner return. And so what ended up happening here is that through a series of events, Kyle Rayner had basically brought back Hal Jordan essentially from limbo or the afterlife or purgatory or whatever you want to call it, and then tried to recreate the Blue Lantern Corps, which had been destroyed during the events of the story with Relic of the Lights Out event. And so as a result of that, what ended up happening here is where Kyle Rayner had tried to reach out and recreate the Blue Lantern Corps, some external force basically destroyed the ring. Now, given the fact that this coincided with the launch of Doomsday Clock and the idea that Dr. Manhattan was essentially in the DC universe, it all stood to reason that Dr. Manhattan was the one who would essentially stop Kyle Rayner and destroyed the White Lanterns in the process, or at least the White Lantern power in the process. But regardless of how you look at it, the result was that Kyle Rayner was basically returned to going back to being a Green Lantern again. Following that, there were a series of stories that were told by Robert Venditti, but again, it was really more of focusing on the entirety of the Green Lantern Corps as opposed to a singular set of events. One of the most notable things that came out of that was Kyle Rayner's son, really the son of himself and Saronic Natu from the future, had basically come to the past, and Kyle Rayner was ultimately forced to destroy him. But the idea behind this is that where Kyle Rayner and Saronic had essentially reformed their relationship, more or less, and where Saronic Natu had led the Sinestro Corps following the death of Sinestro during the opening story of Robert Venditti's run, what you ended up getting was this realization that with their future son having been destroyed by Kyle, and the fact that it was kept a secret from Saronic, this basically instilled a rift in them that was really almost incurable, insofar as Saronic Natu basically said the Sinestro Corps and the Green Lantern Corps will no longer be working together, we're leaving. They went off to their own sector of space. While it seemed like they wouldn't really return to their old ways under Sinestro, which is to say traveling around the universe and just instilling fear everywhere they found it, the rift between Kyle and Saronic expanded out to the core and basically said there would be no more interaction between the Green Lanterns and the Sinestro. If one crossed the other, they would end up going to war, right? So it was more or less one of those you stay away, we stay away kind of scenarios, and it sort of went forward from there. The issue with this is that Robert Venditti's run was pretty much as good as Jeff Johns' run, right? Like it was an amazing run of the Green Lantern, but following everything that had gone on so far, what you ended up getting was just this reworking of the Green Lantern under Grant Morrison, which I have not been reading. At the moment, I don't really think we have an explanation of what's going on with Kyle Rayner or where he stands. I haven't really seen him in the Justice League stories by Scott Snyder. DC kind of seems to be all over the place. Whether or not things will shift back to Kyle Rayner in a way that we're familiar with, I'm not entirely sure. But at the moment, Kyle Rayner has really stood as one of the most popular Green Lanterns following his introduction, and while he was the front runner for a time, of course, going into Green Lantern Rebirth, he sort of fell back to the background and really became a background character for a time, with Jeff Johns focusing more on Hal Jordan as opposed to specifically Kyle Rayner himself. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys want my uncensored and versus videos, as well as live Q&As and all kinds of stuff, make sure you guys go check out patreon.com/Comics Explained. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and I will catch you all later. Peace. We've got some new patrons in our top tiers over on patreon.com/Comics Explained. I want to give a shout out to Jason C, Austin S, Jason S, Austin H, Philip, and Austin B, as well as Steven Z, Eagle F, Joey M, and Jeff R, as well as Genosis 916. As always, we just usually keep the last name to an initial. It helps you guys to maintain your anonymity. Some of you guys have expressed concern about having like your first and last name thrown out there for the world to see. I do not blame you. For you guys who have joined up as part of our Patreon tiers that are eligible for Rob Corps Honor Guard rings, those whose rings have been sent out, you should already have them. If you're a new person who just joined up and you've been part of this tier for a month, your ring will be mailed out to you. So I want to say thank you guys for being patrons.